We're going to move now into a panel discussion of this morning's talk, and we have joining us two panelists. We have from Berry College, we have Professor of History Jonathan Atkins, and I thought he might be especially good to have along. He's an expert in 19th century Appalachia and Tennessee, and really knows this area well. I read a photo essay that he did a number of years ago in the Georgia Historical Quarterly about Martha Berry and the origins of what is today Berry College. And I thought, here's an educational, someone who's an educational expert on northern Georgia, and this would be a good person to have. And then I thought, and who else could we get? And because I'm interested in the history of education, I am sort of tied to a online network of people interested in the history of education, and they sent out a list of recent dissertations in the history of education. And I always just kind of, skim through, see if there's anything interesting in what I'm working on, and what should I happen on but a recently completed dissertation done at Georgia State University by this woman, Tanae Harris Davis. And I thought, and it was about an African-American school in Athens, Georgia, and a lot of it dealt with the 20th century, but it really went back to the beginnings of the 20th century. And I thought, now this is interesting. I wonder if she's taken a job in Albuquerque or if she's still local. So immediately I dialed up my friend Mr. Google and looked around, and pretty soon ta-da, local, this is good. And so I got in touch, and indeed, Tanae Harris Davis is still at Georgia State right now. She is the project director for their early college initiative, which is in the Alonzo A. Krim Center for Urban Educational Excellence. So we are so happy to welcome both of our panelists today. And the thing I would also say about panel discussions is that, when academics get together to talk about these things, they often sort of venture widely, So I didn't select people who, have been down mine shafts in Dahlonega, or who are necessarily, experts in Cherokee County history or Lumpkin County history. But so you shouldn't be surprised if, in a very narrow sense, they go off topic. That's partly why we brought them here, is to have them go off topic, okay? We want them to go like way off topic and just kind of take us with them, okay? And so this will kind of broaden our perspective. It'll help us think about the issues raised in Dr. Smith's paper in the first hour. And so I hope you will enjoy what people have to say. Jonathan Atkins, would you like to talk first? Go right ahead. Your mic's on.
Okay. I will stand with your indulgence.
Go ahead.
I practiced it this way. So, thanks, Ken. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and looking forward to our discussion in the next several minutes. And I guess I'm here to present a different aspect maybe of the topics under consideration regarding education in Northwest Georgia. I won't proclaim. Oh, I'm sorry. Is that better? Tell you what, I'll try the stand. Let's see if that will. Is that better? Okay. All right. I'll try to speak more directly into the microphone. I won't endorse Ken's suggestion that I'm an expert on the history of education, but I do know a little bit about the Berry schools, and maybe that can arouse our discussion a little bit. And Yeah, it'll broaden what we're looking at, and Jennifer's paper here a few minutes ago reminds us about the importance of seeing the schools in the context of their time. Because as we know, the ideas about education and the institutions that came about because of those ideas didn't exist in a vacuum. And so we can get an idea about what is going on in the bigger picture that might have had an influence in shaping those ideas and those institutions. And this is particularly important, I think, when looking at the Berry schools because the story of their origin is very well known, but it's also highly romanticized. It's something that the Berry schools, well, the college when I first started there, really played up a lot about the romantic and dramatic origins that brought about the schools. What do we know what happened? Martha Berry was the daughter of a Floyd County planter who was also a cotton factor and a Confederate Army veteran. Martha lived with the family in the estate near Rome. But there was a lot of people in the household, so her father built her a small cabin to serve as kind of a getaway when she wanted to have some time on her own. Well, at some point during the late 1890s, and this would have been when Martha was in her early 30s, she was in her cabin reading her Bible. She looked out the window and she saw 3 boys from the mountains looking at her, but apparently too scared to come up to the cabin. Well, Martha invited them in. She gave them something to eat. She was already kind of disturbed because they were clearly very poor and seemed to have little understanding of anything related to personal hygiene. She started talking with them, was really shocked to find out that they couldn't read and that they didn't go either to Sunday school or to any type of school for an education. Well, she told them some Bible stories, which they had never heard before, again, kind of confounding her horror. She invited them back. They did come back on a regular basis and brought a lot of friends and family members with them, and pretty soon they outpacked, basically, the small cabin where Martha was holding these schools. That convinced her to set up a series of day schools in Floyd County to try to provide an education for these kids. But she was bothered because they would forget the lessons when they were away for a while. Anything that she taught them seemed to be undone when they went back home and were around their families. So in 1902, she determined to open a boarding school so that mountain boys could live there, have the influence of the schools, and learn the basic skills necessary for a better life. Kind of ironic here, she started the school even though she had very little formal education of her own. She was taught mostly by tutors. She did attend a boarding school in Baltimore for about 3 or 4 months, hated every minute of it, and almost was glad when her father had a stroke so that somebody would need to come and take care of him so she could quit school now and go back and stay away from anything associated with formal education. Well, nonetheless, she opened the Boys Industrial School in 1902. And to give it a sense of permanence, to show her commitment to it, she had inherited an 83-acre tract of land from her father, and she now deeded that tract of land to a corporation that would be in charge of running the school. Technically, a board of trustees now would be in control of the school. In reality, Martha called the shots. She was in charge until she died 40 years later, and it really was her project. Her intention was for the boys to work to pay for their education and also to support and build the schools, to build the buildings, to provide all the necessary things that needed to be done. And in addition to what the boys called book learning, her curriculum stressed living skills like grooming and cleaning, along with vocational training in agriculture and the mechanical arts. Well, despite the use of student labor, the schools needed external support to survive, so Martha spent much of her time on what she called begging trips to raise money for the school. This actually got the school its national name. She became very well known for her fundraising. She ended up being very good at popularizing the schools and explaining what her mission was. On one of these early trips in 1907, she met with President Theodore Roosevelt in the White House. Now, Roosevelt felt that as president, he should not contribute himself. There would be some legal and other problems with that. But he did give the schools a resounding public endorsement and put her in touch with several donors that did, help give some financial support for the school. Now, this visit is significant mainly because in their conversation, Roosevelt asked why Martha hadn't set up a school for girls, too. And in response, Martha lied. She said, "We're planning for a school for girls, and that will be open very soon." She returned to Rome, explained to the trustees that we needed to start a girls' school. They protested, "We're not ready, it's going to be too expensive, it's just something out of the picture." Nevertheless, she persisted, and the school opened up in 1909, a year basically before President Roosevelt himself, after his administration, visited Rome while on a tour of the South. Well, from this foundation, Berry eventually expanded her schools to include a junior college that opened in 1926. The junior college soon became a senior college, graduated its first class in 1932. Eventually, the boys' school, the girls' school were shut down, and the college today stands as the only survivor of the original institutions that Martha Berry had established. Now, the story of the Berry schools after Martha's death is pretty interesting in itself, but to keep the focus somewhat related to the conference topic, we'll look at the late 19th, early 20th century, try to broaden the context a little bit. Again, see what was going on that might have influenced Martha's decision to create these schools. First of all, just need to ask really, who were these poor mountain children? Who were the ones that Martha wanted to help? What was going on with these people? Well, for the most part, they were the children of Northwest Georgia's small farmers, the yeoman farmers. And we need to remember that despite historians' preoccupation with the planter class and with the African American laborers, the small white farmers actually made up the majority of the population in the South, and particularly in this region as well. Well, before the Civil War, the small farmers mostly practiced a form of what we might call semi-subsistence agriculture. They largely supported themselves through their own labor. They grew their own food, made their own clothes, had a little bit of market connection, growing some surplus that they could sell in the market and buy some necessities. But for the most part, they relied on their own work plus barter with their neighbors, very close communities in many ways. They also became the men who, for the most part, fought in the Confederate Army. Okay? If they weren't able to avoid the draft, they would end up fighting in the Confederate Army. They came back to a region that was largely devastated by the war, which I understand Ken talked about quite last night, just the extent of the devastation, the economic hardship that people faced. Well, like the African American freedmen, the yeoman farmers needed to get a fresh start. They needed to try to get back on their own 2 feet to support themselves. It's a long process, but the end result is they go into debt. They end up having to produce cotton for a market specifically. Their production of cotton joined with the plantation's production of cotton produced an oversupplied market that, with changing international conditions, dropped cotton prices down to as low as a cent a pound in the 1890s. Really bad situation where it seems like you're getting deeper and deeper and deeper in trouble with no way to get out. Well, the result was many of these farmers end up losing their land, either land they were squatting on, or many of the people actually did own their land, end up losing it because they just simply can't pay their debts. Stephen Hahn, the historian, has shown that much of it actually was bought up by local planters who were actually doing fairly well, maybe not great, but living off the labor of their African American sharecroppers. They were producing enough of a cotton crop that they were getting by okay. So kind of, 2 different directions. The planters going one way, the mass of the population going another. Now, I've never been able to check this out, and have no intention to do so, I'll readily admit, okay? But I've always wondered whether one motivating factor for Martha might have been a sense of guilt. That is a realization that her father and others in her class might be the ones responsible for the students, the boys' ignorance before their poverty. That is end up displacing these people, buying up their land, good economic opportunities, but the end result was the human cost of people being pushed aside. We could find out, the records I'm sure are there about land purchases and land transfers in the late 19th century. Again, as long as Martha signs my paycheck, I don't intend to do so. But, the point is simply that the freedmen and their descendants that Jennifer talked about, along with the small white farmers, lived in an economic system that really didn't provide much opportunity for poor people, whether white or black. It also was a system that didn't give the established elites much incentive really to invest in any sort of education. In that environment, it's worth noting the freedmen schools really did have an uphill battle that involved more than just racism. Okay? Racism was part of it for sure. Just kind of get some of the complications, the intricacies of what's going on here. Several years ago, Mills Thornton and Peter Wallenstein, for Georgia specifically, noted that in the years right after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, the tax burden for a landowning white farmer increased 400 to 500%. Okay? Now again, it doesn't sound like much today, but we've talked some about how this was a lot of money at the time. Before the Civil War, if you own a 100-acre farm, 160-acre farm, you're talking about maybe $1 a year in taxes. Now you're talking about $5 a year. in taxes, which again, you know, in a time when you're getting restarted, you don't have stuff much because of the devastation in the war, could really be burdensome. What Mills Thornton did is point out kind of the political implications of that. Who was imposing these taxes? It was the Republican governments that had taken control in 1867 as a result of Reconstruction, or military Reconstruction. Who is the money going to benefit? Well, there's a lot of charges of corruption against these Republican governments. That there's some corruption, but it's probably been blown out of proportion just how much there was there. Who do the Republicans represent? Well, to most Confederate veterans, white Southern farmers, they're there because of blacks. They're there because they came to take our slaves away, and now they're taking our money away to help out those people. Probably intensified a lot of the discomfort that Jennifer pointed out and that we know was taking place among Southerners here, white Southerners in the years after the war. Racism was a factor. It's an uphill battle for the Berry schools, and racism, we have to acknowledge, was a factor at the Berry schools as well. Martha shared much of the bigotry that was all too common among the white Georgians of her era. It's just worth noting that the children and the grandchildren of the freemen that Professor Smith discussed, they have no place in Berry's early story. They're just simply not there. Now the reality is there are African Americans for sure in Floyd County. It's roughly about 1/3 of the population at the time, I believe. But in the early accounts, the discussions at the Berry School, there just are no black people there. And that's a reflection of the racist dominance of the school at the time. Maybe worth noting here as well, it wasn't just African Americans who were excluded. Jews, Catholics were also not admitted as students. Not that there was a significant population here, but that lasted long after the early years of the school. Jews or Catholics were not hired on the faculty or the staff as well. Really not until the years after World War II, and really 1950s, 1960s, I believe it is, when the first Jews or Catholics hired at the school. There's a story, excuse me, story that circulates among the faculty that don't hear as much these days, but used to. You know, initial years, the buildings on campus were built mainly by student labor, but really by the 1920s, you were starting to hire contractors, professional builders to build the new constructions. The story is that the Board of Trustees were considering hiring a Jewish-owned construction firm in Atlanta to build a new building. And when Martha found out about it, she simply stated, "No Jew will ever work on my campus." Put a stop to it at that point, okay? Now, that changes again, obviously, in the years after World War II. The integration of the school, something I know a little bit about. I can talk about that in the discussion period if it comes up. But I want to conclude just briefly by pointing out two issues very influential in the Berry School's years and might have some relevance to what my colleagues are presenting and the discussion as well. First, just to note Berry's curriculum. As we noted, it really stressed vocational training. Agricultural and mechanical skills that, to be honest, soon after World War II and maybe even before, were largely obsolete. It's a similar circumstance to some of the criticism against Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee Institute, which was being praised by whites as a model school. Among many African American leaders, you're training people for jobs that don't exist. You're training them these vocational skills, but what are they going to do when they finish? Because there just aren't jobs like that out there in a changing economy here. Even as early as 1915 when Washington died. Well, in Berry's case, it had to move away for reasons that are, well, kind of complex after World War II. Today, the college considers itself a comprehensive liberal arts college, but to be honest, there still is kind of an identity crisis with Berry. What really is our purpose? Is it professional programs like business, like education? We're adding nursing, in fact, to the program. Or is it liberal arts, really to study history, to study literature, to study religion, to study topics like that, and really broaden the mind and expanded human capabilities? I bring this up mainly because I'm curious about how Berry's curriculum compared to others in the schools in the region. From Jennifer's comments, it sounds like the Freedman schools focused on literacy, but then also what she called the uplift of the race. I presume that would refer to educating citizens, knowledge of fields like history, like civics, so that African Americans could know their rights while supporting themselves in the post-emancipation era. It just makes me wonder what different schools tried to stress, in particular what private schools were founded, what they tried to stress and tried to get across. What was their purpose really before public schools became available? And even then, really what was the purpose of the public schools? What were they trying to teach as they tried to stress education, expand education? The other area to bring up, just mainly, if nothing else, it's one of the conference topics, the area of religion. Okay? Berry today describes itself not as a Christian school, but as a school with a Christian heritage. It's never had a denominational affiliation, and a lot of that, I think, simply has to do with the fact that Martha herself was part of the Episcopal Church, while all the mountain children were overwhelmingly Baptist. And rather than try to maybe, conform to a certain mold nobody was comfortable with, just left it, okay, we're a Christian school at the time, but we don't really support or have any connection with any denominational affiliation, which would have, again, brought in a lot of ties, a lot of controls that Martha wouldn't want it to deal with either, okay? She didn't like control, at least other people's control, for sure, okay? Still, Martha and the boys and the girls were united by a general Judeo-Christian evangelical outlook that agreed on the fundamental points of the faith. They might disagree on drinking and dancing, although Martha herself was a teetotaler, so we're told. But they would agree on things like the fatherhood of God, the divinity of Christ, basic, general Christian principles like that. Religion and Bible courses were included as part of the Berry curriculum's first day. Possibly because of the disagreements denominationally, more likely because of Martha's interest, the school and its teaching never stressed really theology. When teaching Christianity, it stressed Christian service. That was how you express Christianity. Even when I started there, I've been there 22 years now, there's never really been a very heavy stress on theology or theological aspects of the school, heavy emphasis on Christian service. Well, I bring this up just because, religion sort of pervaded Jennifer paper as well. It's pervaded the conference also. I suspect it played a big role in other schools' curriculum, even the Freedmen's Bureau schools and the other African-American schools that were set. And it's easy to overlook this, particularly as religion has taken a different role in our modern culture, particularly over the last 50 or 60 years. 100 years ago, that Judeo-Christian mindset did prevail in Northwest Georgia, and it did have an influence on these schools. It has a strong legacy on these schools as well in many ways, and many schools deal differently with it. So I think it's just worth bringing up and keeping that in mind as we discuss these schools, to remember that religion did have a big influence on the founding of these schools, the shaping of them in their early years. Okay? And with that, I'll pass the baton on. Take my microphone with me and have a seat. Okay. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I am truly happy to be with you all this morning. I do get out in the city, but not as often as I would like to. So I'm very happy to be out of the concrete jungle into this beautiful oasis of trees, land, and water. As I was standing just after the break, after Dr. Lund gave her talk, your director of school, the dean of the students came over, and we were talking about our time at Georgia State. I didn't know that he was a fellow alumnus. We actually had the same advisor. Philo Hutchinson was our advisor. I just graduated in 2012 and he graduated in 2009, so we were there. I came in 2007, so we were there around the same time. And I say that because this is my first talk post graduation. Usually when I've spoken at conferences, my advisor's right there in the audience cheering me on. So now he will serve as a proxy to my advisor. My work, my dissertation, looked at the Black segregated school, just looking at it from a different perspective. A lot of times when we think of the Black segregated school, the first things that come to mind was thank God they were integrated or thank God they closed down. But when you really speak to people who went to segregated schools, they speak about the caring teachers, the strong leadership, and so on and so forth. And there is more scholarship, more research, especially more scholarship and research detailing these segregated schools and the good things that did come out of them. Dr. Vanessa Siddle-Walker from Emory is a lead scholar in that area. So I looked at the Black segregated school in Athens, Georgia. I grew up there for a good portion of my life, and so I looked at Bernie Harris High School. It was initially Athens High and Industrial High School, and I just did a historical review of the school along with the desegregation process. But before I get into that, I would just like to read a response to Dr. Smith's talk, and then we'll get into how that kind of ties into my dissertation. So Dr. Smith's scholarship is recognized for its accurate, although historically under-researched acknowledgement of the Black community's desire for and effort at obtaining an education in the United States. The effort at education, which began during the days of slavery, as Thomas Weber so aptly demonstrates in his book, Deep Like Rivers, to the effort that was sustained after emancipation until seeming success with the dismantling of de jure segregation in the 20th century. Blacks in America have consistently demonstrated a strong desire for an education. This desire was particularly noted by proponents of compulsory education in South Carolina during the turn of the century, when they insisted that blacks were already going to school, whereas the white child may stay home if he is not properly equipped to go to school. The black child will, quote unquote, take a hunk of cornbread in his pocket, pull up his one gallus, and go along to school, end quote. This proponent went on to say that the black child was already using his resources, and it was time for the white child to do also. The Black community is further noted for its monumental sacrifices that it made, in the pursuit of an education. Dr. Smith speaks to these sacrifices as she notes a particular Black community in Dahlonega, Georgia, and the sacrifices considering the tuition blacks were paying in order to attend school, no matter how difficult it was to garner. James Anderson speaks also to this willingness of the Black community to make sacrifices that weren't necessarily required of other communities. Double taxation is one such sacrifice that is widely known within the history of Black education, in which the Black community would place an additional tax upon itself to properly fund its schools upon the diversion of its state and or local funds to white schools within the school district or county. Dr. Smith also aptly speaks to the preference of the Black community to direct its educational goals in regards to its priorities and agenda. This argument is further supported in Colonel John R. Lewis's observation. He was the superintendent of the Freedmen's Bureau of Georgia, in which he noted the preference of blacks to attend black-run private schools in which tuition was higher, $1 per month, as opposed to the 25 cents or 50 cents per month at bureau schools. Further, in 1866, the Georgia Education Association was formed by a group of Black leaders in an effort to encourage newly freed blacks to establish schools for their counties. By 1867, blacks had already established 191 schools and 45 night schools. This desire to be captain of their educational fate shone through within the Black community during this time. The overall tenor of the paper, in which Dr. Smith delineates the history of education for blacks in northern Georgia, further exposes an underrepresented history of newly freed blacks making concerted efforts at establishing a system of education created for and by their community. It is important that history be continuously uncovered so as to provide a complete and accurate understanding of the history of education in America. And so I wanted to stop there and just bring in my dissertation, because it seems as though Dr. Smith's premise for Black education is on the idea of self-help and basically your ability to direct your own future and path in education. And since newly freed people fought for their schools, it is then not consistent to believe that Brown versus Board and the fight for educational equality had to do with wanting to shut down their own schools in favor of attending white schools. So when you then go speak to the Black community about the segregated schools, they speak about, the 4 areas they speak about are strong leadership, caring teachers, the strong academic curriculum or the extracurricular activities, and the community's support. As I mentioned, I did an oral history, and this had to have probably been the perfect dissertation for me to do. I was able to speak to people ranging from in their 50s until 80. I think my oldest participant was 82 or 86. Almost everyone that I spoke to about 18 participants in Athens, Georgia, and almost everyone that I spoke to spoke about these 4 different areas as far as strong leadership. They spoke about H.T. Edwards, who served as the the longest serving principal during the 20th century, at Athens High Industrial School, which later became Bernie Harris High School. His connection to the community, his caringness for his students, but his stern nature. That was one thing that they continuously spoke about. The principals meant what they said and said what they meant. There was no wavering, but they appreciated that. They knew why the principals did what they did as far as being very stern and being very adamant about their education, because they knew what the principals knew what was out there for the students. And they knew that the education was the key to being able to achieve. Not necessarily in the world that they lived in now, but the world that was to come. The 18 participants also spoke about the caring teachers. In fact, they spoke about it by using almost those same words. My teachers care for us. The teachers were almost just as strict and as stern as the principal. One participant, who was now one of the few black doctors in Athens, spoke about how one of his English teachers had impeccable English, and if you walked down the hall and she heard you destroy the English language, she would stop you immediately, no matter who it was, and make you say it correctly. And so things like that they remember from their teachers that helped them to get to where they are today. Another respondent said that whenever his teacher felt as though the students were not being focused, he would have them to take a look at Athens High, which was the white school, take a look out the window and look at Athens High, because when they're studying there and you all are goofing around, there forms a wider chasm between what you all will possibly be able to do in life and what they can do in life. So that was his way to get his black students focused again, and he remembers that to this day. Not only were the teachers caring, but they were very competent. I think in some scholarship pieces there is a question as to whether or not black teachers were as competent as what was required. And, not only in the dissertation did it kind of lay that to rest, but the participants spoke about that also. They never felt as though that their teachers were not competent enough to lead them in the direction, educational directions they felt that got them to where they are today. Then the academic curriculum, extracurricular activities. Again, they spoke about having to take the algebras, the geometries, the pre-calculus, things of that nature. There was no subpar education, at least at Athens High Industrial School in Athens, Georgia. The extracurricular activities, of course, they spoke about the band, the plays, and just having a community atmosphere in which the school was an integral part of it. And lastly, the community support, which brought in the community whenever there was something going on at the school. The community was there to support the students. One particular respondent said that when the teachers did come, when the parents did come to the school for a play or so on and so forth, they weren't there just for the play. They weren't there just for the basketball game. They were there to see how their child was doing. So that stayed with this respondent. And so my dissertation then went on to the desegregation process. About 2 of my respondents were intimately involved in the desegregation process at Bernie Harris High School, in which Bernie Harris, formerly Athens High Industrial School, changed from a middle school, and Athens High, the white school, was changed to Clark Central High School so that it could be an integrated school. At times, the interviews were very emotional because they had such pride for their school, and that's one reason the school still stands to this day. Many of our segregated schools, many of the black segregated schools were eventually closed down, were made into office buildings, and all the legacy was lost. But when you go to Athens High, Bernie Harris High School is still there. The building is still there. It's now called the H.T. Edwards Building, which is named after the longtime 20th century principal there. And they're also using it for vocational school in Athens. But the desegregation process was a very tumultuous one. it wasn't as tumultuous as other communities that we've seen, and a lot of times the respondents said it's because it was set in Athens. So Athens, because UGA is there, is a little bit more progressive than the surrounding towns and other towns in the Deep South. But it was tumultuous nonetheless. I know most of you are probably familiar with our former Labor Commissioner, Michael Thurman. He was a part of this desegregation process, and he was one of my interviewees, and he actually was one of the main students who led the desegregation process, a process that included protests, running to the white integrated school to say we're not coming, and then subsequently having the police officers come to his house and him just thinking his life was over at that point. Going to the school board, speaking to the school board, actually forming committees such that Bernie Harris High School, the colors from Bernie Harris High School can coalesce with the colors from Athens High, such that you have, the colors are now gold and red. Athens High was red and white. Bernie Harris High School was blue and gold. So they brought the two colors together. So this was very different in Athens, he told me, because the backdrop of UGA, so that they could have a committee to try to have as smooth as possible integration process. However, he said it did take years to get to that point. So just to go back to Dr. Smith's piece, it's very, very refreshing to hear that there's more scholarship out there. There's continuous scholarship about the notion that prior to and soon thereafter emancipation, blacks were wholeheartedly in control, trying to be in control of their educational pursuits, and that did lead into the 20th century. So when we start to think about the desegregation process, when we start to think about the black segregated school, although there was an effort at equality, the effort was not to totally dismantle the black school, because these schools had been in process since 1865. So it was not to dismantle and to discredit the black segregated schools, but the effort was educational equality. So I'll stop there, and I guess we can continue. Thank you.
I'll keep my remarks very brief, and then we'll let Dr. Smith respond to them. I had my shot yesterday, and the thing I would emphasize is, cooperation. It seemed, today we talk about private education or public education, but it's so clear from the talk we heard this morning that in the 1860s and beyond, this is, local communities, church buildings doubling up as schoolhouses. It's a government agency, the Freedmen's Bureau, but it's also coordinating relief efforts from missionary societies and benevolent organizations. And so there's this, there's just this sort of, we make a distinction or oftentimes a dichotomy that simply didn't exist in the minds of people at the time. And I'm reminded of that too. Yesterday I showed a slide of the advertisement for Waleska High School, and down toward the bottom, which you really couldn't read because the newspaper gets so dark down there, but what it said was, children who come to Waleska High School, their portion of the school fund will be paid into the Waleska High School. So, in other words, it was sort of like what we would today call a voucher system. If your kid goes to the Waleska High School, whatever is their allotment out of the, if they're 1/200th of the children, then they'll get 1/200th of the school fund, and that portion will help defray their tuition at this Waleska High School. And so there's just a kind of mix of church organizations, of public funding, of government agencies all at work here. And also, there's a lot of cooperation and sometimes not cooperation. Martha Berry, I believe, banned the citizens of Rome from the campus. Is that right? And Yes, she's like, can't have that influence here. That's bad. All right, and there was also, you know, the school at Toccoa Falls was funded by Atlanta women, and there were a lot of locals up there who were like, we don't need your stinking urban money, you know, and so what you doing up here, you know? But the thing is, you know, a lot of times, even with these kinds of, even in these situations, you know, you see that there is a lot of local support, and certainly at Reinhardt, the country around here, you know, because it really is so poverty-stricken, moonshining, partly as a way of, you know, steady income becomes you know, it's just rife all through these hills. You know, you don't go just walking around in the woods. I mean, you just don't. Okay, it sounds nice, but don't do that. You know, stay out of the woods, kids. And Reinhardt, this school had a very anti-alcohol emphasis with that sort of, you know, rural Methodist background. And yet, I never find that any hostility toward, you know, Reinhardt College. I don't find it. And in fact, in the 1890s, when Cherokee County farmers got into the Alliance movement, which was designed to improve life for the farmers, Reinhardt, on commencement weekend, which was a 3-day weekend, one of their days was Alliance Day in the 1890s. So they're saying to the farmers, we're not ignoring you, right? And you know, we are preparing in many ways your children for a different world than the one you're living in, but we support you, and especially on Alliance Day, come on out to Waleska, to the college. So I'm just struck by that, by the white communities, black communities, these interracial relationships, and the deeding of the land, and the you build the building, and we'll see how it all works out, and struck by the appeals to the mining companies, business interests, to see if they'll help support schools. And this to me just bespeaks a need to really think about these modes of cooperation, and in some ways lack of cooperation, that are so important in the creation of education in Georgia after the Civil War. Dr. Smith, you want to say a few words? You can sit, stand, whatever you like.
I'll sit if I may.
Yeah.
And is it okay if I go a little bit beyond North Georgia?
You go wherever you want.
Okay. You brought out the cooperation, and indeed there was some, but in some cases I'm going to argue that there's cooperation. You do see that in Dahlonega, but I think it's for a purpose. I think that the black community knows that they're outnumbered and they need to work with the white population. And certainly, while William Price did help them, he was also charging them quite a bit of money that he knew they didn't have to put a lien on that church building, for example. But then his other thing, that the black community had to promise never to try to get into North Georgia, which of course wasn't struck down until the civil rights bills went through, suggests that there's sometimes not so much coordination and cooperation. And if I can go down to South Georgia and Savannah, for example, Savannah had, the American Missionary Association came down into Savannah to establish schools. They were very aggressive in the way that they did that. And, but there had already been a free black population in Savannah that had set up schools that were sometimes pretty good schools. They had a Savannah Educational Association, and particularly as it came time to set up public schools, the question was, who's going to be in control of these schools? Is it going to be the Savannah Education Association with their black teachers? The American Association did have an agenda, and it was in part a religious agenda. They wanted to establish congregational ideas, but also the idea of northern industry, and they were really concerned when the Catholics came in. That was just, you know, we got to make sure that we take over that situation. So there could be a lot of uncooperation, but sometimes that moved things forward too, I'll suggest.
We're happy to take questions, and you can pose them to anyone up here. And so we have a student with a microphone, and that would help your question be heard. So if you've got a question, just raise your hand. Mr. Carafa will come around with the microphone, and we're eager to hear what you have to inquire.
My name is Sharon Christensen, and I'm a retired educator and principal. And this is a topic that is always taking the back shelf to the Civil War era, simply because of the fighting. And you don't talk about Reconstruction or the carpetbaggers in any way, shape, or form. I can't imagine what it would have been like to develop these types of schools. My main question is, first of all, after the end of the Civil War and the slaves were emancipated and started making these schools, how far did they have to come in order to attend the school? Their proximity. Also, on the education of the schools, when did it become compulsory education? And the other one was, how did you assess what these schools were accomplishing, even though they were very poor and very small? Now, I have 12 questions, but I only asked 4.
Well, I think a lot of children had to come for quite a ways, and of course they'd be walking. So if Wooten had 115 pupils, as he claimed, and sometimes I wonder about his numbers, but they would have been, you know, having to walk. Eventually there were some schools further out in the country, but if there were only 4 schools, there were people who were going to have to walk quite a ways. And I think that most of the schools didn't go way up into the mountain area. I think they were more in towards town, and Cavender Creek, which is not up in the mountains yet. Okay, that's one question. How to assess them? There's really no way for me to be able to go back. What I look at are the Freedmen's Bureau records, which have teachers' records and sub-assistant directors' records that mostly focus on how many students are attending, who's supporting the school, are you teaching them, you know. I guess in some ways they will ask how many people are advancing into, say, this particular arithmetic level, and it's very, very small. Because I'm kind of focusing on those very early years before it gets subsumed into a public education system. I'm looking at that transition. But it is kind of hard to really assess that. But I get the feeling that you're starting off with a group of people in the mountains that don't really have any education. So it's very small, the number of people who are in advanced studies or anything like that. And of course they don't have books, a lot of them. So that's a problem for them. So I think it's just anything that they can, you know, they just don't have the resources, the books, the slates, or anything like that. They're doing what they can. And so it's a beginning. It's a small beginning. There was another question, wasn't there? Oh, in general, compulsory education began during what we call the progressive era, which was in it's the turn of century. Even then, though, a lot of the schools in the mountain areas and farming areas were 3-month schools, 2 to 3 month schools. So it was a short period of time. And even when they passed compulsory education, they didn't pursue it the way, say, No Child Left Behind or FYI does. So, you know, it was in place as far as I think, but not really followed through on.
I suspect, Professor Smith knows a lot more about this than I do, I'll readily admit, but I suspect that the early African-American schools were heavily influenced by the common schools. I don't know about Georgia. I know in Tennessee and most other states initially, there would be a fund set up for schools in each county, but what that meant was a parent committee would get some money to hire a teacher for, as you said, for a few months. Anybody could come. You could have a 6-year-old sitting next to a 40-year-old. The emphasis was on the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic to the rule of 3, whatever that means. Okay, you come as long as you want. You don't have to come. There's nothing compulsory. The graded schools that we're familiar with come with, you know, Horace Mann in Massachusetts, obviously. I know Massachusetts passed the first mandatory attendance law. That was in, I believe, 1852. Most northern states did have some type of graded school system set up by the time of the Civil War. For the southern states, it was much later. I would imagine when the Board of Education set up, referred to in Professor Smith's paper in 1871, that was to try to set up schools throughout the state. The mandatory laws did come later, progressive era, I'm sure. But as she noted, there are just not many out there. In Floyd County, for example, there's a couple schools in Rome. I think there was one rural school, and that was it. So if you wanted to go, it was a long way, obviously, to get there, and you couldn't spend much time there.
And just as an aside, while my Massachusetts people seem so benevolent setting up their educational system, it was because they were really concerned about the Irish immigrants coming in, and they wanted them to get a good Protestant education.
Just to further piggyback off what Dr. Smith said, with trying to determine whether or not the schools were up to par or progressing, of course you look at the Freedmen Bureau's records, and a lot of times you just have to go off the teacher's opinion. There are no hard statistics, but a lot of times the teachers would laud the efforts, especially of the black students. The black students come every day. The black students will cram themselves into this one-room school building, but it wasn't a lot of information dealing with, and they know this multiplication table at this time, and so on and so forth. So they just gave a lot of opinions as to whether or not they were taking part in the educational system. And as the compulsory laws, as before mentioned, of course, is during the progressive era. In South Carolina, as they were determining what kind of educational system they had, the issue of the black child attending school was always at the forefront. And finally, one of the legislators says, look, we need to stop always having the race question in front of us when we're dealing with education, because even though we may have a compulsory law, who's really going to force the black child to go to school? Who's really going to enforce that rule for black children? So let's just go ahead and have it so that our white children can make sure we're there, because we know the black children are going to school. But let's go ahead and enforce these compulsory laws such that our white children can go to school, because we're really not going to enforce it for the black community.
If I could, I'm not an educator. I'm just here because I'm interested in the topic. But, you know, what's fascinating to me, listening to what happened after emancipation, when that occurred, is my son graduated from college some years ago and ended up in the Peace Corps, ended up teaching English in Zimbabwe. And education there, he was at a school, and the kids go to the school, and the only thing that he had to teach them to read was the back of cereal boxes. And what we had to do was, he contacted us, and I was able to find a library at a school somewhere in North Carolina near the coast that was giving up some of its books. I was able to fill up a van, take it back, and get the kids at the high school to pack them up we sent them over there, and he created a library for them over there, which you know, we went and visited him about 2 years, I guess, after that, and the town elders came out, and they were just so proud of the library that they had. And it's kind of like I'm getting this in a global sense of what's happening here. But my question really is a little bit different. We talked yesterday, I think, about Reinhardt and Young Harris and Emory at a college level. And at the same time that this was occurring, we talked about Augustus Reinhardt going to Atlanta. And about that same time, the historically black colleges were starting. You had Morehouse, and then some years after that, you had Spelman. How come that didn't click up here in North Georgia? Was it because of Appalachia, because of the poverty, because of what were some of the reasons that maybe those types of institutions didn't take a hold up here in North Georgia at the time?
Are you talking about colleges for African Americans, for example?
Yeah.
The numbers here were just too small. So what happened was that Atlanta University was kind of the premier institution for African Americans who wanted a higher education, and that's where they went. And yeah, I think it's because there was such large numbers in that area that they could reach more people.
Dr. Davis, Bob Hart. I'm just sort of curious, with your interviews with when you were doing your research and talking about what the segregated school was like with those people, if you could make any comments comparing your education with what you found talking with those people?
Okay. A sense of belonging was there. I went to school, part of my elementary school time was spent in Decatur, and the rest was spent in Athens. I went to school in Athens as far as middle school, elementary, and high. And what they conveyed about their school was a feeling I don't quite think I could ever get from my school and my school experience. They felt a sense of belonging, they felt a sense of ownership, they felt a sense of family coming from the school. They speak about the school like they just graduated last year. They have these memories of their teachers. They could, I can't remember all of my teachers, and I'm young, but they remember their teachers, first name, last name, where the teachers were from. Their teachers lived in their neighborhood. Their teachers were their Sunday school teachers. Their teachers were the friends of their parents. And so it was much more than just a center for academic improvement. It was a center for livelihood. It was a cultural center. And I just didn't get that from my school. My school was there for academic purposes. My school was there for community service, but it was not in the same way. My school experience was definitely not how they experienced it. Now, since Athens is small, I did have, my counselor in high school was also went to my school, also went to my church. My sister actually married her son, and so we're very close in that respect. But, so I guess in that relationship, that's probably how that segregated school in Athens was. Your counselor was also went to the same church as you did. It was also friends with your parents. And so in speaking to the people that went to the black segregated school, it was just a family feeling much more than what I experienced growing up. Yeah.
You think it's just because of all the diversions or something as time goes on that we don't have that family feeling that existed back then? I'm trying to, public education today is such a problem, right? Especially in the cities, and trying to figure out, or not figure out, but how are we ever going to get out of the mess that we're in?
I think it also has to do with the feeling that these students felt that these principals, these teachers, from the janitor to the cook, they were invested in them, invested in who they are as a person and who they are educationally. I do professional development also at two local elementary schools in Atlanta. And I was speaking to one of the teachers. This is her second year teaching. She's teaching at an inner city school. And she's just exasperated at what she is finding there. She said that the parents aren't really involved. And so I asked her, well, what does that look like to you? She said she would like certain things from the parents she isn't getting as far as discipline-wise, as far as academic. I said, you have to understand, when these parents send their students here to this school, they're expecting you to be the expert. They're expecting you to have, to be in charge of every essence and being of that child for 7 hours a day. And she said, I actually never saw it that way. I thought I was just here to teach them 1 + 1. You're there for much more than that. You're there to make sure. She said, I'm not here to discipline them. I said, you are, because that's part of their essence, that's part of their being. You're there to discipline them. You're there to make sure that their cut is covered with a Band-Aid if it needs to. If you need to kiss it, you need to do that. You're there for their entire essence and being for 9 months that you're in their classroom. And she said she thanked me for that because she never saw it that way. Now she understands why her parents may not be as, participate as much as she would like to, because I said when they drop them off at 8 o'clock in the morning, you're responsible for that. Don't call them. Don't tell them your child is acting up. They expect you to handle it. And we don't get that as much in our schools now. In the black segregated school, you got that. You got paddled. you got that. But now, I'm not saying that paddling is the answer. I'm just saying that was part of the teacher saying that I'm responsible for your entire development and not just for your academic development. So.
I'm following this. So the segregated students you interviewed, do you think that any of them, or did they express that at the time of integration, were any of them regretting integration? Were they against integrated schools? Did they express that they had preferred to keep their own schools?
Yes. Believe it or not, what they said they were fighting for was educational equality. That's what they wanted to stress. They said we didn't have the best books. We knew we got the books from Athens High. We knew we got their old uniforms, their old band uniforms. Now, mind you, Athens High had red and white. Bernie Harris was gold and blue. Some kind of way the parents were able to change those red and white uniforms to gold and blue. So it said we understood that. But that didn't matter to us. What we wanted was educational equality. What we wanted was the opportunity to go to whatever school we wanted to go to. So in the board deciding to shut down Athens High Industrial School, the black school, and send all the schools to the white school, they longed for their school. They longed for what we talked about, the caring teachers, the strong leadership, because they felt as though they didn't belong there. This wasn't their school. They were going to a foreign place.
I can understand that. They've lost their identity, and the school was their identity. And a lot of this happened, I've done a lot of research with rural one-room schools. I did a book about rural one-room schools, and I interviewed former students that attended rural schools, and it was the exact same thing. They grew up with a sense of community, a pride in their school. They were attached to their teachers. Of course, they sometimes had the same teacher for 8 years. But, so I think a lot of this is not so much black and white. I think it's small communities, neighborhood schools, and now we are in such, the schools are so huge. You have elementary schools that have 2,000 students and, 300 teachers and staff. And there's no way that the principal can know 2,000 students. And there's no way that the parents can know all the staff. We have lost so much with our consolidation. It's my opinion.
more than a question, it's kind of a comment. I grew up in northeast Kansas, and in a very small rural area, which still is. And we had black families, we had some Hispanic families. They came to my house and spent the night. We played together, we did things together. I don't ever remember it ever being any different. I was the 5th generation to graduate from the high school I graduated from, which was also the same building that I went from kindergarten through 12th grade in, and still is. So when you talk about the ties that the black children had in their schools, that is something, because I think of where I grew up, I had too. And my teachers were, just like you said, family friends. You didn't even act up in the summer because they were going to tell your parents. I mean, it was just the way it was and still is. And I think that is, to me, what is so sad about education today in the large schools, is that just so much is lost. But we just didn't, I never even realized that there was segregation going on, or integration or anything, because of where I grew up. And until I actually moved away from that area and became an adult, did I even ever question that any of the things that y'all have talked about today would have even happened, because of, some people just had a lifestyle that led them to believe that everybody got the same education, everybody went to school together, everybody went to church together, and that's the way it was. So it's very, very enlightening to hear about all the things that really, really did happen, that I completely missed out on. Maybe I was blessed.
If I could just interject here, and this is from looking at what happened in Savannah. Now, granted, this was back in 1865 through 68, and this was the place where black teachers and parents were trying to negotiate to be the ones who could keep control of their children's education with black teachers. And I don't know if this goes up here, but they were very specific that there was a sense of affirmation that black teachers could give the black children that white teachers probably would not. They'd be much more condescending, patriarchal to those children, considering, just because they're biased, they consider them as inferior. So that, I can't speak to your people, but I know that was something that was very much a concern for them during Reconstruction, even then.
Do we have a final question or comment? I see right here.
Done? Okay. It's called rose gold. We've been up to Dahlonega and they talked about that. It was pink in color.
I know what you're talking about, but I don't know anything about the metallurgy there.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of you for coming. This has been, I think, just the most enlightening morning. I've benefited from it, and I wish you all a good day. It looks like it's not raining, and so a perfect time to get out and about. Before you go, if you would, if you have not already, we have a yellow evaluation sheet, and if you would just fill that out, we can report back to the Georgia Humanities Council people's feedback about our program. And Professor Unger is in the back, and he'd be happy to accept that from you, or I'll be happy to accept that from you. And thank you so much for coming. Also, if you want to hear about future programs, there's a little thing on the program for today that says just fill out your name and an email contact, and we'll get in touch with you for the next History Symposium. All right. Thank you all for coming.